This lesson is on trapunto and quilting. After a discussion of materials and tools, I'm going to demonstrate trapunto, and then this is hand quilting with hand stitching, and this is machine quilting. So this is a channel quilt. This is a diamond quilting. This is our lesson. We have a lot to do, so let's get busy. Before we begin the quilting and the trapunto, I'd like to just show you a few of the materials and tools that you're going to need. This works with any kind of fabric. So what I'm choosing here is a Duchess satin, and for my backing, it's just inexpensive muslin. If this is going to be a two-sided piece, obviously you would use a dressier fabric for the backing, but we're going to assume that this is a piece that is going to be lined. So what you have on the back should be thin and inexpensive. From here, batting. Batting is a little different than what's called wadding or stuffing. Batting obviously is rolled out into sheets. This is a polyester batting, and if you really look at the texture, you can see what look like little dots, and that is because it is what's called needle fused. Since it is polyester and it will have a tendency to shed through the fabric, they use hot needles and stab through to hold everything together. This can be just regular batting. There is also a fusible version so that when you put it between the two layers of fabric, you can press it with steam and it will stick. So batting. Now let's look at marking tools. This chalk, Perfection Master crayons, number 999. I'll show you the little box too. And you can see Colonial Tailoring Supply is where you get it. This is a chalk it's like a clay chalk, but the beauty is it disappears. The quick is 72 hours. I use the slow, which gives you 168 hours. So if you mark your fabric with this, you can either wait 168 hours, quicker if it's raining, or you can just hit it with a little steam and it will vanish. The advantage of this particular chalk is, especially if you're working on silk, this does not leave an oil stain like a wax chalk. It's more like a clay chalk. You have to sharpen it, of course, but for marking a lot of different kinds of things, this is my go-to chalk. From here, the friction pens. These disappear with heat. I tend not to use these on the face of the fabric unless it's going to be washed. You would just hit it with a little bit of, you just run the iron over it. You don't even have to hit it with steam. It will disappear, but sometimes it leaves a trace on the front side of the fabric. So test your fabric with this to see if it's going to leave a mark before you use it. Now, holding things together. This is a straight pin, but it's not a common straight pin. What this straight pin does, it's bent. And so you can get it into your quilting so you can pin the quilting together. So if you're laying out your backing, you're laying your batting on, you're laying your top fabric on, these are easier to work when you're pinning the layers together before you quilt it. Quilting pins. And then finally, this is a magic thread. This is, there's the needle. This is called water-soluble basting thread. Now, if you're going to be washing something and you need to hold everything together, this is your thread. You just baste all the layers together as many times as you wish. You sew all of your quilting, then you wash it, this disappears. The thing to understand though, when you're threading your needle, don't lick the end of the thread because it will disappear. I've done that. Not a lot of tools, as you can see, but some important ones. So, We have a lot to do. Let's get busy. For our trapunto, I have used the friction pens to mark the motifs on the fabric. Now I'm going to be introducing you to a technique called free motion quilting. There are two ways of doing this. One, if you have a machine that has a darning foot. The other, if you have just a regular sewing machine that doesn't have a darning foot. So let's get started. On this machine, it has a setting where you have the feed dogs up or down. When the feed dogs are down, that means you can hand guide the work and not have to worry about counteracting the feed dogs. The object of the work here is to use your hands to move everything around. This particular foot is called a darning foot. Some machines have them, some machines don't. You would look at your instruction manual for your particular machine to determine whether or not you have one. So here, I'm going to put the needle in, starting on the line, and then lower the presser foot. Now you want to hold this thread to begin with so that you don't end up knotting anything underneath. And really, you just steer, and you can steer pretty much in any direction. The darning foot keeps the fabric from popping up so that the machine would skip a stitch. And so then you could just move to another section and continue on. And it's really that easy. It takes a little practice. But you know, another area where this is useful is if you are appliquing lace, if you're appliquing lace motifs, this is a really good technique to know about. Now you notice that the needle always stops down. Modern machines make it so that you can turn on that feature where you stop the needle down or up. Okay, so I'm going to work forward and I will meet you back here. Okay, here we are. And let's have a look at the stitching. Now, something to be aware of. When you're moving the stitching, if you slow it down, the stitches get longer. If you speed it up, the stitches get shorter. On some of the machines, they have a device to even out the stitches, but this is something that practice will help you to achieve. Now we'll go back to the work table and trim the threads. Here we are. Let's just zoom in and trim off these threads. Okay, here we are. So I have one sample ready for the trapunto. Our next step is introducing you to a tool called a spring needle. This is a tool called a spring needle. It's a regular machine sewing needle. It works in your regular home sewing machine. And what you're seeing here is it has a spring and a little stop, so that this particular stop and the spring functions like the darning foot. This makes any machine, really, any home machine, so that you can sew without a presser foot. So you can sew the free motion embroidery. I will get out one of my old sewing machines and show you how this works. This is my venerable old Singer Featherweight. I'm going to put my hand over scale. You can see this is not a very large machine. It has a little bed that flips up like this. It is a legendary machine if you ever see one, especially if someone's cleaning out a garage or an attic and gives it to you, you take it. It makes a beautiful stitch, and it weighs 11 pounds at the very most, so it's very portable. Now I'm going to get a little closer in the next shot. I'm going to show you the spring needle and setting up this machine for working. You can see here I have removed the presser foot. I've also removed the needle. So this is the needle clamp. Presser foot down, presser foot up. So what you want to do with your spring needle is pull this loose. You don't want to take it off. Or, you know, if you really needed to, if you needed to change the needle, you could take this off and recycle it with another one. But to put this needle in, you want this to be free. You want the needle to seat up as tightly as possible, and then this will hit the bottom of the needle clamp. So let's see. There, just put this in. And you want to push and clamp it. So this then hits the bottom of where the needle mounts. Now, one thing I like to do is let me just zoom in here. You don't have to put the needle or the thread through the final guide, but you want to actually thread the needle. There we are. Okay, so now that the needle is in and threaded, I'm going to change camera positions, and then let's talk about testing. So here we are, ready to sew, and you can see I've worked ahead and done a little experimentation. So then you make sure you put the presser foot down. If you leave the presser foot up, it releases the tension, it won't work. So have the presser foot lever down, and then you hold your threads tight, and you want to hold the fabric flat against the bed, and then see, the object here is you really want it to be held flat. Now, if you're working on quilting with a batting, that's going to be a little easier to do. I'm just using two fabrics laid together. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you. Okay, if you notice, see here, you have white stitches showing. What that tells me is that the top tension needs to be looser. The stitch needs to drop down. So I'm going to loosen the tension a little bit. And so then let's sew that. Yeah, better. I apologize for the manicure. And so see here, it won't be quite so apparent if you use matching thread on the bobbin. So I'm going to now go and get our sample fabric and bring it back here. Now, just one little tip here. You have this little plastic spacer. See how the thread is here? It's not passing over that section. Set it up when you're threading and when you're working, so that it works that way. It'll give you a better stitch. And here we are, working away. It works pretty much the same as the other one. Again, you have to really practice to make it even. And I personally need to kind of get warmed up before I'm doing this, but I'm following the lines. Now, as far as technique, something to kind of know is that I rest the heels of my hands against the bed of the machine, and I like to use my fingers more to steer. So being able to do that is going to make it so that you're not going to wear out your shoulders, because otherwise you can get a lot of fatigue in your shoulders. So this free motion thing, it's going to save you a lot of trouble in a lot of different ways. And just because your machine isn't automatically set up for one, doesn't mean that it's impossible because of the spring needle. Schmetz has them. And so, yeah, there we are. I will go off camera and finish. Okay. So here we are. Give you a little close-up here. And the party in the background. So I'm trimming off the last of the threads. So here we have two different examples of free motion stitching. I'm going to use this one for the trapunto. In trapunto, we stuff different portions of the motif instead of laying a batting in and patting all of it and then sewing through it. So in this section, which you can see, we have all of the different petals and we have the center portion. Now, one way of stuffing them is to have a fabric that's loosely woven where you would feed things in through the little hole and then you would bind it up. We're not going to do that. This, we're assuming, is going to be a lined piece. I can get rid of some of these threads here so it's not quite so confusing. So let's just fill this one first. So the object here is that you want to make a little tiny cut just through the backing fabric. And it doesn't have to be huge. I'm going to zoom in there. It doesn't have to be huge. And so to prepare the stuffing, I have a little bit of it here. You can tear away some from the batting. And this is called teasing it up. You break it up so that it's really more stuffing than batting. So yeah, so here we now have some stuffing. And really, it's a matter of pushing the stuffing into the hole. You could use a tweezers if you want, or a large-eyed needle. I'm using this called a bodkin. It's a double-ended implement. And as you tease it up, you just keep stuffing more in, and you can distribute it around. And you could make it as fat or flat as you wish. So as with everything else, with these embellishments, you would want to make a sample before you actually committed to doing the actual piece. So I think that's going to be plenty good. It's going to be a nice fat little petal here. So now you have this little hole. So what you can do, I have a needle threaded here. Before you close this up, you can take your needle and shove around the batting inside the space. So yeah, you just adjust this around to make sure that you don't have any thin spots. You make sure it fills out quite nicely. So then once you have it the way you wish, then it really is a simple matter of sewing it neatly closed. And like I said, this is going to be a lined garment. There are other ways of doing it if you're going to have something that's double-sided. But generally, when you're working with something like this, you're going to be working with a house or with someone whose expertise it is on this. And so once you're done with that, you can then just distribute it around. So then when we turn it over, you have a thick section versus the ground fabrics. So I will go off camera and finish the trapunto, and I will bring it back here. Here we're finishing up. I must admit, my stitches look like the Frankenstein monster. But you know what? It's going to be lined. You'll never know. Now let me flip this over. So here we have it. Trapunto. Now this one is machine stitched, but for those who don't have a foot on their machine or the spring needle, you could actually make your trapunto using a running stitch. Both are correct. And here we have trapunto. To set up the quilting, there's what's called pin basting. So you can see here with the safety pins, we have the front, the batting, and the back fabric. And you lay it all out, and you pin at intervals, as you can see, so that you make sure all the layers are laying as you intend them. So here I have my sample, and you can see I've marked out the lines in the disappearing chalk. So it's considered good form to not have the thread show on, or the knot of the thread show on the back. So let's just say that is where I want to start my stitching, but I'm going to turn over to here, go back in that hole just through the muslin. You can give a tug or two, and then just make sure that you hit right on the line that you're aiming for. There we are. Yeah, okay, we're on that line. So now, this is the idea here. You don't want the knot to show on the outside, so what you'll do She'll just give it a little bit of a tug. You tug it right, there you go. It snaps through. So the knot sits between the layers, you don't see it. But you have a knot on your thread. And really, this is just a running stitch. You can make these as long or as short as you wish. I'm using embroidery floss 3 plies. And so for this exercise, the channel quilting, I'm just going to hand sew. I will take this off camera and hand sew because you've seen me sew a running stitch before. I will bring it back when it's complete. We're on the last row. And you can see here that I left the pins in. I tend to leave the pins in until it's all sewn down. Now, as I'm stitching this last bit, something to think about, something to talk about from the design standpoint. You sew all of your quilting or your trapunto before you cut the garment out. Because what you'll see here, you can kind of see it already, is that you can get some shrinkage. So if you just assume that your garment is going to land on the same size, and then you cut your quilting and trapunto out, that's not a good thing. So now I'm just going to secure my thread, bury the end. See if you do that, snap that back in, and then you can give a little bit of a tug, and then makes a nice clean end. So from here, you remove the pins. It's not looking too bad. There we are. So I will take this over to the pressing table, give it a bit of a steam, and bring it back here. And here we are. You notice the steaming evens out the tension and makes the channel tufts nice and smooth. Also, the steaming gets rid of the chalk marks. So this is hand stitching, channel tufting. What you'll do then is trim off the excess of the batting and the backing fabric, and your sample will be complete. Now, machine quilting. This is our fabric that we will be using for machine quilting. Now you notice this is stitched in a diamond configuration, but the layout, which I will do off camera, is pretty much the same. You have the base fabric, you have the batting, you have the face fabric, and I will put some pins in. Then I will meet you at the sewing machine to show you how to sew by the machine quilting. What you see here is what's called a walking foot. It's also called an even feed foot, and you can get these for pretty much any machine. What I would recommend is that call your machine manufacturer to see which one that they would recommend for your particular machine. So I have my fabrics pinned together. So what I'm going to do, see, the object here is, whenever possible, work from the middle to the outer edges. So I'm going to start roughly midway, and so now the stitch length on this is like a 3.5 stitch. You don't have to have a really short stitch on this. So the general rule here is the thicker the fabric, the longer the stitch. So with this, a longer stitch is in order, and you can remove your pins as you're going along. Now you notice I'm not turning around, going back the opposite direction. When you're working, You want to sew all of the rows in the same direction. If you were to turn around and come back here, you would get weird little diagonal wrinkles because the fabric would have shifted. So everything sews in the same direction. And so, as I said, from midway out. Now you don't have to alternate this side, this side, this side, but you could. But from the middle to the outside. Okay, as before, I will continue sewing this first direction, and I will meet you back here when I'm finished. Almost done. Now, if you were just sewing channel tufts, if they run parallel like this, that is what's called a channel tuft or channel quilting. You would still sew them in the same direction. I know that sounds kind of like I'm being a little old lady when I keep talking about it, but really honestly, if you don't want disappointing results, stitch everything in the same direction. So here we have one row or one direction. Now we're going to turn around and sew in the opposite direction, again from the middle towards the outer edges. So yes, again, I've sewn one side, middle to the outer edge, and I will continue on to finish. And we're done. Now, you don't absolutely have to have the walking foot. It falls in the category of things that are nice to have, but if you don't have it, it's not going to kill you. The thing is, you just want to make sure that everything stitches in the same direction. So you can see no strange ripples, no puckers. I'll take this over, hit it with some steam, and I'll meet you back at the work table. And here we have the diamond quilting by machine. We have channel quilting by hand, and we have Trapunto. And our lesson is finished.